The explosion tore through the morning stillness, like God's own thunder sending a plume of black smoke and debris high into the desert sky. Wyatt Cross threw himself behind an overturned mining cart as chunks of rock and timber rained down around him, his ears ringing from the blast that had just collapsed shaft 4 of the Esperanza mine. "Jesus Christ," someone screamed. "There's men still down there." Wyatt scrambled to his feet, his mining foreman instincts overriding the shock. The explosion hadn't been accidental. Someone had set charges in the tunnel supports, timing them for maximum devastation during the morning shift change. Through the settling dust and chaos, he counted the miners stumbling away from the wreckage. 12 men accounted for. 3 still missing. "Who's got the roster?" he shouted. "Here." Pete Morrison thrust the ledger into his hands, his face pale with terror. Jenkins, Murphy, and Torres were checking the north tunnel when she blew. Wyatt studied the collapsed entrance, his trained eye reading the destruction like a book. The blast pattern was wrong for a gas pocket or faulty powder. This was deliberate sabotage designed to look like an accident. And somewhere in that tomb of twisted metal and broken stone, 3 good men were either dead or dying. "Cross." Marshal Jake Ramsey's voice cut through the shouting as the lawman rode up on his black stallion, flanked by 2 deputies. "What the hell happened here?" "Someone murdered my men," Wyatt said flatly, not looking away from the wreckage. This was no accident. Ramsey dismounted with practiced ease, his bulk intimidating even without the badge pinned to his vest. The man had drifted into Black Barrow 2 years ago, with a reputation for keeping the peace through fear and violence. And the town council had been happy to pay him well for his methods. "That's a serious accusation, Cross. You got proof, I got experience." Wyatt pointed to the blast pattern. Charges were set on the main supports timed to bring down the whole tunnel system. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. "Or maybe," Ramsey said with a cold smile, "your safety protocols ain't as good as you think. Been hearing complaints about conditions in these mines, about corners being cut to maximize profits." The accusation hit Wyatt like a physical blow. He'd run the safest operation in the territory, had personally inspected every tunnel, every support beam, every stick of dynamite. But 3 men were dead because someone wanted to destroy the mine, and Ramsey was already preparing to pin the blame on him. "Those men had families," Wyatt said quietly, "and they'll be compensated accordingly, assuming the mine owners accept responsibility for their negligence." Behind Ramsey's calculated words, Wyatt heard the real message: shut up, accept the official story, or face the consequences. The marshal controlled Black Barrow's version of justice, and crossing him was a sure way to end up dead in the desert. But as Wyatt stared at the collapsed mine entrance, another face swam before his eyes. Sarah Cross, his sister, dying of fever in a mining camp infirmary, while doctors who could have saved her were too busy counting bribes to care about a poor girl with no family connections. He'd failed her 2 years ago, standing helpless while corruption and indifference claimed her life. "Not again, never again. I'll be conducting my own investigation," he said. Ramsey's expression didn't change, but something cold and deadly flickered behind his eyes. "I wouldn't recommend that, Cross. Sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie." That evening, Wyatt sat alone in his cabin on the outskirts of town, nursing a bottle of whiskey and studying the explosion site through his window. The official investigation had lasted exactly 2 hours, long enough for Ramsey to declare it an industrial accident and close the case. The families of the dead miners would receive a small compensation payment, the mine would be sealed permanently, and everyone would move on with their lives. Everyone except Wyatt. He'd spent the afternoon quietly interviewing the surviving miners, piecing together a timeline of events that painted a disturbing picture. Someone had been asking questions about the mine's layout for weeks, specifically about the tunnel system and support structures. Someone with enough knowledge to plan the perfect sabotage. A knock at his door interrupted his brooding. Wyatt answered it to find Lena Walsh standing on his porch, her painted face streaked with tears, her usual confident demeanor replaced by genuine fear. "They killed him," she said without preamble. "They killed Torres." Wyatt's blood turned to ice. I thought he was still trapped in the mine. He wasn't. He got out through a maintenance shaft on the north side, hurt bad but alive. Made it to Doc Peterson's place around noon. Lena's voice broke. Someone put a bullet in his head while he was lying in the infirmary bed. The implications hit Wyatt like an avalanche. Torres had survived the explosion, which meant he could have identified the saboteurs. Someone had made sure he'd never get the chance. Who else knows? Doc Peterson found the body, but Ramsey got to him first. Official story is that Torres died from his injuries. Natural causes. Lena grabbed Wyatt's arm with desperate strength. But Torres was conscious when I saw him. He was trying to tell me something, writing letters in the air with his finger. Over and over the same word. What word? Mira. He kept spelling M-I-R-A, like he was trying to warn someone. Wyatt had never heard the name before, but something about it sent a chill down his spine. Who's Mira? New girl at the cinder house. Showed up about 6 months ago, half dead from exposure. Silas took her in, but she's different. Can't speak, can't hear. Communicates through writing and hand signs. Most of the customers think she's simple, but I've seen her eyes. There's intelligence there and pain. Lots of pain. The pieces were starting to form a pattern, though Wyatt couldn't yet see the complete picture. A mysterious explosion, a murdered witness, and now a connection to Silas Montgomery's brothel, the one establishment in Black Barrow that operated under Ramsey's direct protection. "I need to see her," he said. Lena shook her head. "That's suicide. Silas has been nervous as a cat all day, and Ramsey's got men watching the cinder house. Something big is happening, Wyatt. Something that goes way beyond a mining accident." But Wyatt was already reaching for his gun belt. His mind made up. He'd failed Sarah by being too far away when she needed him. He wouldn't fail another innocent person by being too cautious to act. Then I better get there before it's too late. The cinder house squatted on Black Barrow's main street like a painted cancer, its yellow lamplight spilling onto the boardwalk through windows that had seen too much sin and suffering. Wyatt approached from the alley, using shadows and architectural features to avoid the casual surveillance he'd spotted at both ends of the block. Through a crack in the shutters, he could see into the main saloon, the usual collection of miners, drifters, and local businessmen seeking escape from their daily lives. But tonight, there was an undercurrent of tension in the room. Conversations conducted in hushed tones and nervous glances toward the back of the building. Silas Montgomery stood behind the bar, polishing glasses with mechanical precision, while his eyes constantly scanned the room. The brothel owner was a thin man, who dressed better than most people in town, with calculating eyes and a mouth that smiled without ever meaning it. Tonight he looked like a man expecting trouble. "I heard they're bringing in new girls from El Paso," someone was saying. "Younger ones, if you catch my meaning." "About time," replied another voice. "Getting tired of the same old merchandise?" Wyatt's jaw tightened at the casual dehumanization, but he forced himself to remain focused. Somewhere in this building was a girl named Mira, and somehow she was connected to the explosion that had killed 3 good men. A commotion from the back rooms drew his attention. Male voices raised in anger, followed by what sounded like furniture being overturned. Then came a sound that froze his blood. A woman's desperate choking sob, the kind of sound someone made when they were being hurt and couldn't scream. Wyatt had heard that exact sound before in a tent outside Tucson, when fever took Sarah and she couldn't even cry out for help anymore. The memory galvanized him into action, driving him through the cinder house's back door with reckless determination. The narrow hallway was dimly lit and thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and cheap perfume. From behind a door marked 3 came the sounds of violence, a man's heavy breathing. The crack of flesh hitting flesh, and underneath it, all those terrible silent sobs. Wyatt shouldered open the door and stopped dead. A girl who couldn't have been more than 19 knelt on a stained mattress, her dark hair matted with blood, and her dress torn to rags. Above her loomed a fat man in expensive clothes, his face flushed with drink and cruelty. The girl's mouth moved soundlessly as her hands rose in quick, desperate gestures, sign language. Wyatt realized, though, her attacker was ignoring her completely, but it was her eyes that destroyed something inside Wyatt's chest. Wide brown and filled with the same hopeless terror he'd seen in Sarah's face during her final hours. The same silent plea, please, someone, help me. The fat man turned toward the door, his mouth opening to voice some complaint or threat. Wyatt's fist connected with his jaw before any words could emerge, sending him crashing backward into a washstand in an explosion of water and ceramic shards. Get out. Wyatt snarled, his hand dropping to the Colt at his hip. Now. But the stranger was already scrambling toward the door, blood streaming from his split lip. You crazy bastard. Do you know what you've done? I paid good money. Wyatt's gun cleared leather with fluid precision, the barrel centered on the man's chest. Years of military training might fade, but they never disappeared entirely. I said, get out. Heavy footsteps thundered in the hallway as Silas burst through the door with two of his men, their faces hard as granite. Cross what in hell's name? Your customer was leaving. Wyatt said, not taking his eyes off the girl. She'd pulled a thin blanket around herself, but her hands continued to move in those strange, quick gestures. She was trying to tell him something urgent, her dark eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Like hell he was leaving, Silas snapped. That man paid for the whole night, and by God he's going to get what he paid for. Not tonight, not ever again. Silas studied Wyatt with calculating eyes, clearly weighing his options. You always were too smart for your own good cross. But this ain't your fight. I'm making it mine. Then you're a damn fool. Silas jerked his head toward his men. Teach him how things work in my house. They came at him fast, but not fast enough. Wyatt put the first one down with his gun butt across the temple spun to catch the second with an elbow to the windpipe. The man dropped, gasping for air. Through it all, the girl watched with wide eyes, her hands moving in rapid signs that seemed to convey both gratitude and warning. This ain't over, Silas said quietly, his voice carrying a promise of future violence. No. Wyatt agreed, backing toward the door. It sure as hell ain't. He holstered his weapon and walked out, leaving the cinder house behind, but carrying the image of those desperate, intelligent eyes with him into the desert night. For the first time in 2 years, he had a purpose beyond simple survival. But as he made his way through Black Barrow's darkened streets, Wyatt didn't notice the figure watching from an upstairs window of the cinder house. A figure that lifted a hand to trace letters in the condensation on the glass, spelling out a single word over and over: help. Dawn brought no peace to Black Barrow, only the harsh reality of a town built on secrets and sustained by violence. Wyatt spent the early morning hours at the cemetery, standing beside 3 fresh graves that marked the final resting place of Jenkins, Murphy, and Torres. The official story was already spreading: tragic mining accident, faulty safety procedures, unfortunate but unavoidable loss of life. Only Wyatt knew the truth, and truth was a dangerous commodity in a place like this. He figured I'd find you here. Lena Walsh approached through the morning mist, her painted face showing the strain of a sleepless night. Heard you caused quite a stir at Silas's place last night. Word travels fast. Word travels fast when it involves federal marshals and territorial investigations. She handed him a folded piece of paper. This came for you an hour ago. Writer from Tucson Official Dispatch. Wyatt read the message twice, his expression growing darker with each word. The territorial governor's office was sending investigators to look into irregularities in Black Barrow's mining operations, with particular attention to safety violations and potential criminal negligence. Someone with connections in high places was taking the explosion very seriously. Ramsey's scared, Lena observed. Been making rounds since before sunrise, talking to people, making sure everyone understands the official version of events. And what about the girl, Mira? Lena's expression grew troubled. That's why I'm here. She's gone. Gone where? Nobody knows. Silas claims she ran off sometime during the night, probably spooked by all the commotion. But I've been asking around, and there's something that don't add up. She lowered her voice to barely above a whisper. 3 of the other girls saw men loading something into a wagon behind the cinder house around midnight. Something heavy wrapped in blankets. The implications hit Wyatt like a physical blow. They killed her, maybe. Or maybe they moved her somewhere safer. Someone who can't speak is awfully convenient when you need witnesses to disappear. Wyatt studied the dispatch again, noting the official seal and formal language. Whoever had requested this investigation had serious political connections, the kind that could override territorial corruption if properly motivated. But investigations took time, and dead witnesses couldn't testify. There's something else, Lena continued. About the mine explosion. I've been talking to some of the girls who service the mining camps, and they've been hearing stories. Strange men asking questions about tunnel layouts, offering good money for information about shift schedules and security procedures. What kind of men? The kind who dress too well and carry too many guns. The kind who work for people with serious money and serious problems. A new possibility began to form in Wyatt's mind, one that connected the dots between the explosion, Mira's disappearance, and Ramsey's obvious nervousness. What if the mine hadn't been the real target? What if someone had been trying to eliminate a witness to something far more damaging than industrial sabotage? I need to search the mine, he said. The hell you do. Ramsey's got guards posted around the clock, and they shoot first and ask questions later. Then I'll have to make sure they don't see me. That afternoon, Wyatt approached the sealed mine entrance through a network of arroyos and rock formations that kept him hidden from casual observation. The guards were exactly where Lena had predicted, 2 men with rifles positioned to command clear fields of fire across the approaches to Shaft 4. But they were watching for frontal assault, not for someone with intimate knowledge of the mine's secondary entrances. Wyatt had helped survey this claim 3 years ago, knew every tunnel, every ventilation shaft, every maintenance access that honeycombed the hillside. The old air shaft was exactly where he remembered it, concealed behind a jumble of boulders, and accessible only to someone willing to crawl through 50 yards of narrow tunnel. The passage was barely wide enough for his shoulders, but it led directly into the mine's lower levels, well below the collapsed sections. What he found there changed everything. The lower tunnels hadn't been damaged by the explosion, and in the flickering light of his carbide lamp, Wyatt could see clear evidence of recent activity. Fresh footprints in the dust, discarded food containers, and most telling of all, a makeshift camp that had obviously been occupied for several days. Someone had been living in the mine, hiding in the deepest tunnels where even the most thorough search wouldn't reach them. But why, and more importantly, where were they now? His answer came in the form of scratches on the tunnel wall. Crude letters carved into the rock with desperate determination. Help. They killed Papa MS. MS Mira Santos. Wyatt felt his heart racing as he studied the message. She hadn't just been a victim of Silas's operation. She'd been a witness to something far worse. And whoever had killed her father was now hunting her with methodical thoroughness. A sound from deeper in the tunnel made him freeze the soft scrape of boots on stone, moving with careful precision. Someone else was down here, someone who knew these passages as well as he did. Wyatt drew his gun and moved toward the sound, every sense alert for danger. The tunnel curved sharply ahead, opening into a natural cavern that had been expanded by previous mining operations. And there, huddled in the farthest corner with a small candle for light, was Mira Santos. She looked up as he approached, her dark eyes widening in recognition, and something that might have been hope. She was alive, but barely thin exhausted, and obviously running on pure desperation. When she saw him, her hands moved in rapid signs that he couldn't understand, but whose meaning was unmistakable: gratitude, relief, and urgent warning. She grabbed a piece of paper and wrote quickly, "They're coming. Set trap. You shouldn't be here. Neither should you." Wyatt replied softly, "But here we are." From somewhere above came the sound of voices getting closer. The trap Mira had warned about was already in motion, and they were both caught in its jaws. The voices above grew more distinct as they approached at least 4 men, moving through the upper tunnels with the confidence of people who knew exactly where they were going. Wyatt recognized Marshal Ramsey's distinctive baritone among them, along with the higher pitch of Deputy Briggs, and 2 others he couldn't identify. "Should have handled this weeks ago," Ramsey was saying. "Now we got federal investigators breathing down our necks and too many loose ends." "The girl's just one person," replied an unfamiliar voice with a slight accent. "One person who can't even speak. One person who can write and who saw too much before we realized how dangerous she was." Mira's hand found Wyatt's arm in the darkness, her grip tight with fear. She pulled out her paper and wrote frantically, "They killed my father because he found something. Evidence. I have it." "What kind of evidence?" Instead of writing, she reached into her torn dress and withdrew a small leather pouch. Inside were several photographs, grainy images, that showed men loading unmarked crates onto wagons under cover of darkness. Even in the poor light, Wyatt could make out faces: Ramsey, Silas, and several well-dressed strangers who obviously weren't locals. "What's in the crates?" he whispered. She wrote quickly, "Guns. Stolen from Army shipments. Being sold to Apache raiders and Mexican revolutionaries. My father was a freight driver. He discovered the operation by accident. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. This wasn't just local corruption, it was arms smuggling on a territorial scale with profits that would justify killing anyone who threatened to expose it. And Mira had been carrying the evidence that could destroy the entire network." The voices were getting closer now, echoing off the tunnel walls as the search party descended toward their hiding place. In minutes, they would be discovered, and Wyatt had no illusions about what would happen next. Dead witnesses told no tales. "Is there another way out?" he asked. Mira nodded and pointed toward a narrow opening in the cavern wall, barely a crack in the rock, but it seemed to lead somewhere. She'd obviously explored these tunnels thoroughly during her weeks of hiding, mapping every possible escape route. They squeezed through the opening just as lamplight began to flicker in the main cavern behind them. The crack led to a natural chimney that angled upward through the hillside, following a geological fault that had probably been carved by water centuries ago. Climbing in darkness was treacherous, especially with Mira weakened by weeks of inadequate food and constant fear. Wyatt helped her up the steepest sections, his hands guiding her placement on the rough stone. Below them, shouts erupted as their pursuers discovered the abandoned camp. "They were here." Ramsey's voice boomed with fury. "Search every tunnel, every crack in the rock. They can't have gone far." The chimney finally opened onto a hillside, covered with scrub oak and juniper invisible from the main mine workings. They emerged into late afternoon sunlight, both gasping from the difficult climb. Mira collapsed against a boulder, her face pale with exhaustion. "Can you write?" Wyatt asked. She nodded weakly, then wrote, "Where?" It was a good question. Black Barrow was compromised, the territorial authorities were potentially corrupt, and they were being hunted by men with unlimited resources and no scruples about murder. But the photographs in Mira's pouch represented their only chance at justice, if they could get them to someone with the authority and integrity to act on the evidence. "Tucson," he said. "Federal Marshal's office. It's a long shot, but it's the only shot we've got." They made their way carefully down the hillside, using the terrain to mask their movement from potential observers. In the distance, dust clouds marked the positions of multiple search parties spreading out from the mine. Ramsey was throwing everything he had into this manhunt, At the bottom of the hill, hidden in a grove of cottonwoods, Wyatt had cached supplies and a spare horse preparation for exactly this kind of emergency. As a mining foreman in dangerous territory, he'd learned the value of having escape routes ready. "We'll travel at night," he explained as they prepared to leave. "Stay off the main roads. Follow the old Apache trails through the mountains. It'll take longer, but it's our best chance of avoiding patrols." Mira wrote quickly, "Why are you helping me? You don't even know me." The question cut deeper than she probably intended. Why was he risking everything for a girl he'd met less than 24 hours ago? The easy answer was that it was the right thing to do. But Wyatt knew the truth ran deeper. "I had a sister," he said quietly. "Sarah. She died 2 years ago in a mining camp near Tucson. Fever took her, but it was neglect that killed her doctors, who wouldn't treat a poor girl without connections or money to pay their fees. I was working a claim 50 miles away, didn't even know she was sick until it was too late." Mira's eyes reflected genuine compassion, her hand reaching out to touch his arm in a gesture of comfort. "I keep thinking," he continued, "if just one person had given a damn, maybe she'd still be alive. Maybe all it would have taken was someone willing to stand up and say, 'This isn't right.'" She wrote, "I'm sorry about your sister, but this is different. These men will kill you just for helping me. Then they'll have to catch me first." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the desert in shades of red and gold, they rode away from Black Barrow toward an uncertain future. Behind them, smoke rose from signal fires as Ramsey's search parties coordinated their efforts. Ahead lay hundreds of miles of hostile territory populated by men who shot strangers on sight and asked questions later. But for the first time since Sarah's death, Wyatt Cross had a purpose beyond simple survival. He was fighting for justice, for truth, and for the chance to ensure that his sister's sacrifice hadn't been meaningless. The hunt was on. They rode through the night across terrain that would have challenged experienced scouts, following game trails and dry washes that kept them hidden from casual observation. Mira proved to be a better rider than her delicate appearance suggested, handling her horse with the skill of someone who'd grown up around animals. As dawn approached, they took shelter in a natural cave system that Wyatt remembered from his prospecting days, a series of connected chambers carved from limestone by underground streams. The location offered concealment, fresh water, and most importantly, multiple escape routes if they were discovered. While Mira rested, Wyatt studied the photographs more carefully. The images were remarkably clear for nighttime shots, suggesting that her father had taken considerable risks to document the arms smuggling operation. Several faces were clearly visible, including men Wyatt recognized as prominent citizens of Black Barrow. The bank president, the mayor, even Judge Morrison, who was supposed to represent law and order in the territory. "How long was your father watching them?" he asked. Mira wrote, 3 months. He suspected something when army wagons kept disappearing between Fort McDowell and the territorial capital. Started following the freight routes, discovered the switch points where legitimate cargo was replaced with weapons. Why didn't he go to the authorities? He tried. Went to Marshal Ramsey first before he realized Ramsey was part of it. Almost got killed that night, only escaped because he was faster and smarter than they expected. The pieces were falling into place now. Miguel Santos had stumbled onto a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government, a network of corruption that generated enormous profits by arming both sides in the ongoing conflicts between settlers, Indians, and Mexican revolutionaries. When he'd tried to expose it, he'd signed his own death warrant. "How did you escape?" Wyatt asked. The question brought pain to Mira's dark eyes. She wrote slowly, "They came to our house at night. Killed Papa while I hid in the root cellar. Heard them talking about what to do with me, whether to kill me or sell me. Ramsey said I'd be more useful alive, that a deaf-mute girl would be perfect for his special customers who liked unusual entertainment." The words hit Wyatt like physical blows. The calculated cruelty of it, turning a traumatized girl into a commodity for men's twisted pleasures, revealed the true depths of Ramsey's depravity. They brought me to Silas's place, told him I was damaged goods they'd picked up cheap. For 6 months I endured things while looking for a chance to escape. When you saved me that night, it was the first kindness I'd experienced since Papa died. Wyatt felt rage building in his chest, a cold fury that demanded blood in payment for the suffering inflicted on this brave young woman. But revenge would have to wait. Right now, survival was the priority. The federal investigators, do you think they're legitimate? Mira considered the question carefully before writing, maybe. But the conspiracy has reached beyond just Black Barrow. We can't trust anyone until we know how deep it goes. She was right, of course. A smuggling operation of this magnitude required cooperation from officials at multiple levels of government. The wrong person could easily send word back to Ramsey, dooming any chance of justice. A sound from outside the cave made them both freeze, horses approaching at a steady pace, accompanied by the jingle of spurs and weapons. Wyatt moved to the cave entrance, peering carefully through the concealing brush. 3 riders were following their trail with professional skill reading sign that most men would miss entirely. These weren't ordinary searchers. They were trackers probably hired specifically for their ability to find people who didn't want to be found. "We need to move," he whispered to Mira. But as they gathered their supplies, one of the riders called out in a voice that carried clearly across the desert morning. "Santos, we know you're in there. Come out now and we'll make it quick." The voice belonged to Deputy Briggs, but the tone was different from his usual bluster, colder, more professional. This was a man who'd killed before and felt no qualms about doing it again. "You too, Cross," he continued. "Ramsey's offering good money for both of you, dead or alive. Your choice which way it goes." Wyatt checked his weapons, the Colt revolver, a Winchester rifle, and about 40 rounds of ammunition. Not much against 3 armed men in open terrain, but it would have to be enough. Mira touched his arm and pointed toward the back of the cave system. There was another exit, she indicated, but it was narrow and dangerous. A person could get through, but it would take time they might not have. "Go," he whispered. "I'll hold them off." She shook her head emphatically and wrote quickly, "We go together or not at all. Mira, I won't lose anyone else I care about." The simple declaration hit him harder than any passionate speech could have. In her quiet way, this young woman had claimed him as family, someone worth risking her life to protect. It was a gift he hadn't expected and wasn't sure he deserved. "All right," he said, "together." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the cave entrance as Briggs and his men began their assault. Time was up, and the final confrontation was about to begin. But as they squeezed through the narrow back exit, neither Wyatt nor Mira noticed the 4th rider who'd been watching from a distant ridge, a figure who spurred his horse toward Black Barrow with urgent news for Marshal Ramsey. The net was closing, and their enemies knew exactly where to find them. The narrow passage led to a box canyon that offered no obvious escape route, a natural amphitheater surrounded by sheer rock walls that rose 100 feet above the desert floor. Wyatt cursed silently as he realized their mistake. They'd traded one trap for another, and this time there was nowhere to run. "Can you climb?" he asked Mira, studying the rock face. She examined the walls with experienced eyes, then wrote, "Not these. Too smooth, no handholds." Behind them, shouts echoed from the cave system as their pursuers discovered the back exit. They had maybe 10 minutes before Briggs and his men reached the canyon, and then it would be a straightforward execution, 3 professional killers with high ground against 2 desperate fugitives with limited ammunition. But as Wyatt scanned the canyon walls more carefully, he noticed something that sparked hope. Near the eastern rim, a section of rock showed signs of old mining activity, blast holes, tool marks, and most importantly, the remains of a wooden platform that had once supported lifting equipment. "There," he pointed. "Someone tried to work a claim up there. If we can reach that ledge, we might find another way out." It was a desperate plan, but desperation was all they had left. Using cracks in the rock face and the remnants of old iron spikes driven into the stone, they began to climb. Mira moved with surprising agility. Despite her weakened condition, her small size actually an advantage in navigating the treacherous ascent. Halfway up, the sound of horses entering the canyon echoed off the walls below. Briggs's voice carried clearly in the still air. "There on the rock face, take them down." The first rifle shot sparked off stone inches from Wyatt's head, sending razor-sharp fragments flying. He flattened himself against the cliff face, trying to shield Mira with his body as more bullets whined past them. "Keep climbing," he shouted. "Don't stop." 20 feet above them, the old mining platform offered the promise of cover, but reaching it meant exposing themselves to concentrated fire from below. Wyatt could see the 3 shooters spreading out across the canyon floor, taking positions that would give them clear fields of fire. A bullet caught the heel of his boot, nearly sending him tumbling backward into space. Below, he could hear Briggs coordinating the attack with professional efficiency. "Wilson, take the left side. Murphy, you got the right. I'll keep them pinned down while you find better angles." But as the deputy called out his orders, a new sound echoed across the canyon. The thunder of approaching horses, lots of them coming fast from the direction of Black Barrow. Reinforcements, Wyatt thought grimly. Ramsey must have sent additional men to ensure the job got done properly. The cavalry charge that swept into the canyon wasn't what anyone expected. 20 riders in blue uniforms came over the rim, like avenging angels led by a grim-faced sergeant, who took in the situation at a glance. Federal troops, Wyatt realized, probably responding to the territorial investigation he'd read about. "Drop your weapons," the sergeant bellowed. "You're surrounded by the United States Army." For a moment, nobody moved. Then Briggs made the fatal mistake of turning his rifle toward the soldiers. The deputy managed to get off one shot before a dozen military weapons spoke in unison, cutting him down in a hail of lead. The other 2 gunmen threw down their weapons immediately, hands raised high in surrender. The canyon fell silent except for the sound of horses and the jingle of military equipment. "You folks up there," the sergeant called. "Come down slow and easy. We're here to help." Wyatt helped Mira descend the rock face, both of them exhausted and shaking from their ordeal. At the bottom, they found themselves surrounded by professional soldiers, who treated them with courtesy but obvious caution. "I'm Sergeant Walker, 3rd Cavalry." The lead soldier introduced himself. "We've been tracking a group of armed men who've been terrorizing this area. Mind telling me what this is all about?" Wyatt pulled out the leather pouch containing the photographs. "It's about murder, corruption, and arms smuggling on a scale you won't believe. And we've got the evidence to prove it." As the sun climbed higher over the desert, Wyatt and Mira told their story to federal investigators, who listened with growing amazement and anger. The photographs were examined by experts. Statements were taken, and slowly but surely the full scope of the conspiracy began to emerge. But even as justice finally seemed within reach, Wyatt couldn't shake the feeling that their ordeal was far from over. Men like Ramsey didn't go down without a fight, and a cornered animal was always the most dangerous. The final confrontation was still to come. The federal investigation moved with military efficiency once Sergeant Walker realized the scope of what they were dealing with. Within hours, telegraph messages were flying to Fort McDowell, the territorial capital, and Washington, D.C., while teams of soldiers secured the crime scenes and began rounding up suspects. But Marshal Jake Ramsey was nowhere to be found. "Bastards gone to ground," Walker reported as his men searched Black Barrow from top to bottom. House is empty, office cleared out, even took his personal horse from the stable. Someone tipped him off. Wyatt wasn't surprised. A conspiracy this extensive would have multiple layers of protection, including early warning systems to alert key players when things went wrong. Ramsey was probably halfway to Mexico by now, carrying enough stolen money to live comfortably for the rest of his life. What about Silas? Mira wrote on her ever-present paper. "In custody," Walker replied, singing like a canary trying to cut a deal in exchange for testimony. claims he was just following orders, never knew the full extent of the operation. Wyatt doubted that was entirely true, but it didn't matter now. What mattered was that the nightmare was finally ending, that justice was finally within reach. They spent 3 days in Black Barrow as the investigation unfolded, watching federal agents dismantle a criminal network that had corrupted an entire territory. The evidence was overwhelming: financial records, witness testimony, and most damning of all, the photographs that Miguel Santos had died to preserve. But on the 4th morning, everything changed. Wyatt woke to the sound of gunfire echoing through the town, followed by screams and the thunder of horses moving at full gallop. Through his hotel window, he could see smoke rising from the federal command post, and in the streets below, armed men were systematically hunting down anyone connected to the investigation. Ramsey had returned, and he'd brought an army with him. "Move!" Wyatt shouted to Mira, grabbing his weapons and their few possessions. "We need to get out of here now." The hotel's back stairs led to an alley that offered temporary concealment. But as they reached the street level, the scope of the attack became clear. At least 30 gunmen were moving through Black Barrow with military precision, overwhelming the federal forces through sheer numbers and surprise. "The church," Mira wrote quickly. "Back door, tunnel to the old Spanish mission." She was right. The church offered both sanctuary and a potential escape route through tunnels that dated back to the territorial period. They ran through back alleys and between buildings, dodging bullets and avoiding the systematic search parties that were combing every structure in town. The church door was locked, but Wyatt's shoulder made short work of the obstacle. Inside, they found Lena Walsh, crouched behind the altar, with a small group of townspeople, including Doc Peterson and several of the federal investigators. "Thank God," Lena breathed when she saw them. "We thought you were dead." "Not yet," Wyatt replied grimly. "How many men does Ramsey have?" "Too many," answered Captain Morrison, the senior federal officer. "Professional fighters probably hired with stolen army money. They hit us at dawn, killed Sergeant Walker and half my men before we knew what was happening." Through the church windows, they could see armed figures moving in the street, searching for survivors. It was only a matter of time before someone thought to check the church. "The tunnel Mira mentioned, where does it lead?" "Old Spanish mission, about 2 miles north of town," Doc Peterson replied. "Built by missionaries in the 1790s, abandoned for decades. But the tunnel's been sealed for years." "Not sealed," Mira wrote. "Hidden. I explored it while hiding from Ramsey. Still passable if you know where to look." She led them to a section of the church floor, where several stones could be pried up, revealing a narrow opening that descended into darkness. The tunnel beyond was cramped and dangerous, but it offered their only chance of escape. One by one, they squeezed through the opening and began the underground journey. The passage was barely wide enough for a person to crawl, carved from living rock by Spanish missionaries who'd needed a secret escape route during Apache raids. Behind them, the sound of splintering wood announced that Ramsey's men had found the church. Shouts and curses echoed through the building as they searched for their quarry, followed by the ominous sound of boots on stone as someone discovered the hidden entrance. "They're in the tunnel," a voice shouted. "After them." The chase through the underground passage was a nightmare of claustrophobia and terror. The tunnel twisted and branched, following natural faults in the rock, and in several places, cave-ins had narrowed the passage to barely shoulder width. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew closer, men who were willing to follow them into hell itself if necessary. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, they emerged into the ruins of the old Spanish mission. The structure was mostly collapsed, victim of 2 centuries of weather and neglect, but it offered concealment and defensive positions among the broken walls. "How many came through the tunnel?" Captain Morrison asked, checking his weapons. "At least 6, Wyatt replied. "Maybe more." They spread out among the ruins, preparing for what would likely be their final stand. The federal officers were professional soldiers, but they were outnumbered and running low on ammunition. Doc Peterson and Lena were civilians, with no combat experience. Only Wyatt had the kind of battlefield knowledge that might make a difference. There, Mira wrote, pointing toward a section of collapsed wall. Ramsey. The marshal emerged from the tunnel entrance like a demon rising from hell, his clothes torn and dirty, but his eyes burning with murderous intent. Behind him came his hired killers, spreading out with tactical precision to surround the ruins. Cross. Ramsey's voice boomed across the ancient stones. You've caused me a lot of trouble, but it ends here. Like the only thing ending here is your reign of terror. Wyatt shouted back. You think those photographs matter? You think federal investigators can touch me? Ramsey laughed, a sound like breaking glass. I've got friends in Washington Cross. Friends who value stability over justice. By the time this is over, you'll be the ones branded as criminals and traitors. The first shots rang out as Ramsey's men began their assault bullets, chipping ancient stone and whining off metal fixtures. Wyatt returned fire with careful precision, making every shot count as he'd learned during his military service. But as the battle raged among the mission ruins, a new sound echoed across the desert, the thunder of approaching cavalry. Dozens of horses moving at full gallop. Federal reinforcements responding to the telegraph messages that had gone out before the attack on Black Barrow. Army's coming, Captain Morrison shouted. Hold the line. The tide of battle turned as blue uniformed troopers swept into the mission grounds, overwhelming Ramsey's hired guns through superior numbers and discipline. The marshal himself made a desperate attempt to escape, firing wildly as he ran toward the horses they'd left at the tunnel entrance. Wyatt stepped into his path, his Colt steady in both hands. It's over, Ramsey. The marshal stopped his chest, heaving from exertion and rage. For a moment, they faced each other across 10 feet of ancient stone, two men whose conflict had consumed both their lives. You think you've won, Ramsey snarled. You think this changes anything. There will always be men like me, Cross. Men who understand that power is the only truth that matters. Maybe, Wyatt replied quietly. But there will also be men like Miguel Santos. Men who choose to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. Ramsey's hand moved toward his gun in a last desperate attempt at violence, but Wyatt was faster, his bullet taking the corrupt marshal in the chest before the man's weapon cleared leather. Jake Ramsey fell among the stones of the old mission, his reign of terror finally ended. The aftermath of the battle brought federal investigators, territorial officials, and newspaper reporters flooding into what remained of Black Barrow. The scope of the corruption scandal made headlines across the country, leading to congressional hearings and sweeping reforms in territorial law enforcement. Silas Montgomery, true to his nature, provided detailed testimony in exchange for a reduced sentence. His cooperation helped federal prosecutors identify and arrest dozens of co-conspirators, from local officials to politicians, in the territorial capital. The Cinder House was closed permanently, its girls provided with assistance to start new lives elsewhere. Lena Walsh used her share of the federal reward money to open a boarding house in Tucson, offering sanctuary to women escaping difficult circumstances. She never married, but was known throughout the territory as someone who could be counted on when help was needed most. Doc Peterson testified as a key witness in the federal trials, his reputation for honesty lending credibility to the prosecution's case. He remained in Black Barrow to serve the remaining residents who chose to rebuild their community on a foundation of law rather than corruption. But for Wyatt and Mira, the end of the investigation marked the beginning of something entirely new. What happens now? He asked as they sat on the porch of a small house in Tucson, watching the desert sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Mira wrote carefully on her slate. Now we build something good from all this pain. She was right, of course. They'd both lost too much to simply return to their old lives, Wyatt his innocence and faith in justice, Mira her father and her voice. But from that shared loss had grown something stronger, a bond forged in adversity and tested by fire. 3 months later, They were married in a quiet ceremony conducted in both English and sign language, with Lena Walsh and Doc Peterson serving as witnesses. The service was held in the same church where federal investigators had first interviewed them, a symbol of how justice could emerge from even the darkest circumstances. Wyatt used his reward money to purchase a small ranch outside Tucson, where they raised horses, and Mira taught sign language to deaf children from across the territory. She never regained her voice, but she found other ways to speak through her hands, her eyes, and the fierce love she brought to everything she touched. On warm evenings, they would sit together on their porch and watch the stars emerge over the desert continent, in the knowledge that they'd survived the worst that evil men could inflict, and emerged stronger for the experience. Sometimes Mira would write brief messages on her slate observations about the beauty of the night or plans for the future they were building together. But on this particular evening, as the first anniversary of their wedding approached, she wrote something that brought tears to Wyatt's eyes. "Thank you for giving me back my voice. Not the one I lost, but the one I found." 5 years later, their ranch had become a haven for people seeking new beginnings, former prostitutes, learning new trades, displaced miners looking for honest work, children who needed education and care. Mira had never spoken a word aloud, but her influence was felt throughout the territory as an advocate for those who had no voice. Wyatt often thought about his sister Sarah during those peaceful years, wondering what she would have thought of the life he'd built. He liked to imagine that she would have been proud that his efforts to honor her memory had created something meaningful from the ashes of their shared tragedy. The town of Black Barrow was eventually abandoned, its remaining residents dispersing to other communities where they could start fresh without the shadow of corruption hanging over them. The mine workings were sealed permanently, and the desert began to reclaim the structures that had housed so much suffering. But in Tucson, in a small house surrounded by gardens that Mira tended with loving care, the legacy of that suffering had been transformed into something beautiful. Children who had never heard their own voices learned to communicate through gesture and expression. Women who had been treated as property discovered their own strength and worth. Men who had lost their way found purpose in honest work and simple kindness. On the mantel above their fireplace sat a photograph of Miguel Santos, the man whose courage had made it all possible. Beside it was a letter from the President of the United States, commending their service to justice and the cause of human dignity. But the treasure Wyatt valued most was much simpler, a small slate on which Mira had written in careful script the words that had saved them both. Hope is stronger than fear. Love is stronger than hate. And sometimes the greatest victories come from the smallest acts of courage. The silence had been broken at last, and from that breaking had come a song of redemption that would echo through generations yet unborn. In the end, that was enough, more than enough. It was everything. 10 years had passed since the events in Black Barrow, and the desert had indeed reclaimed much of what man had built there. But on this particular morning, as Wyatt Cross rode through the abandoned town with his teenage son Miguel, named for the man whose courage had started it all, the ruins held a different kind of significance. Tell me again about the mine explosion. Miguel signed his hands, moving with the fluid grace that had become second nature in the Cross household. Born deaf like his adoptive mother, he'd grown up bilingual in English and American Sign Language, bridging two worlds with the easy confidence of youth. Wyatt dismounted near the sealed entrance to Shaft 4, where a simple wooden marker now stood in memory of Jenkins Murphy and Torres. The boy followed suit, his dark eyes so much like Mira's, taking in the scene with the intensity of someone trying to understand history through landscape. Your grandfather Miguel Santos was hauling freight between Fort McDowell and Tucson. Wyatt began his hands moving in practice signs as he spoke aloud. He noticed that army wagons kept disappearing, being replaced with identical vehicles carrying different cargo. Most people would have ignored it, but Miguel Santos wasn't most people. The boy nodded, having heard pieces of this story throughout his childhood, but never the complete narrative. At 16, he was old enough to understand the full scope of what had happened here, old enough to grasp the moral complexities that had shaped his family's history. He started following the freight routes in his spare time. Wyatt continued leading Miguel toward the remains of the cinder house, discovered that legitimate army supplies were being stolen and replaced with weapons bound for Apache raiders and Mexican revolutionaries. The profits were enormous, but the cost in human suffering was even greater. They stopped before the collapsed foundation of Silas Montgomery's establishment, now overgrown with desert scrub and marked only by scattered debris. Miguel knelt and picked up a fragment of painted glass, examining it in the morning sunlight. "This is where you first saw Mama," he signed, in a back room that smelled of fear and desperation. Wyatt replied, the memories still vivid after all these years. She was 19 years old, pregnant with a child she'd never asked for, and surrounded by men who saw her as nothing more than property to be used and discarded. The boy's expression grew thoughtful. He'd known his mother had endured terrible hardships before finding safety in love, but the specifics had always been softened for his young ears. Now approaching manhood himself, he was ready for the unvarnished truth. The baby Ramsey's child, what happened to her? It was a question Wyatt had been dreading, but expecting. Hope Santos, for that was the name Mira had given her, had lived only 3 days after her birth in the mine tunnel. The trauma of her mother's captivity, the stress of the desperate flight, and the primitive conditions of her delivery had been too much for her tiny body to overcome. "She died in your mother's arms," Wyatt said gently, peacefully surrounded by love in those final moments. "Your mother grieved for her deeply, but she also understood that some souls are meant to teach us about the preciousness of life by showing us how fragile it can be." Miguel absorbed this information quietly, his young mind processing the tragedy that had preceded his own adoption. Mira had never been able to bear children after the trauma she'd endured. But she and Wyatt had found each other nonetheless. First, Miguel abandoned at a church in Tucson, and then 3 other children over the years, all of them deaf or disadvantaged in ways that made them unwanted by conventional families. "Is that why you and Mama take in strays?" he asked, using the family's affectionate term for the constant stream of people who found refuge at their ranch. "Partly," Wyatt admitted. "But mostly it's because we understand what it feels like to be alone, to have nobody willing to fight for you. Your mother spent months hiding in these tunnels, living on scraps and hope, waiting for someone to care enough to help. I spent years carrying guilt about my sister's death, wondering if I could have made a difference, if I'd been braver, faster, better." They walked together toward the cemetery, where new headstones had been erected for all the victims of Ramsey's conspiracy. Miguel Santos had his own marker now paid for by the territorial government, as part of their official acknowledgement of the wrongs that had been committed. "We learned that everyone deserves someone willing to stand up for them," Wyatt continued. "Everyone deserves to have their story heard, their pain acknowledged, their dignity respected. That's not charity, son, that's justice." Miguel ran his fingers over his grandfather's headstone, tracing the simple inscription, "Miguel Santos, 1835-1891. He died for truth, and truth lives on." "I want to be a lawyer," the boy announced suddenly. "Like the federal prosecutors who put the criminals in prison. I want to speak for people who can't speak for themselves." Wyatt felt a surge of pride mixed with protective concern. The legal profession in 1901 was challenging enough for hearing men with family connections and financial resources. For a deaf boy with no blood relatives in positions of power, it would be nearly impossible. But then he thought of Mira, who'd survived horrors that would have broken most people and emerged stronger than steel. He thought of Miguel Santos, who'd risked everything to expose corruption. He thought of his own sister Sarah, whose death had taught him that the greatest tragedy wasn't failing to achieve your dreams, it was failing to try. "Then that's what you'll be," he said firmly. "We'll find a way to make it happen." They spent the rest of the morning exploring the ghost town, with Wyatt sharing memories and Miguel asking the kind of probing questions that suggested he'd inherited more than just his grandfather's name. As the sun climbed higher, they prepared to head back to Tucson, where Mira would be waiting with lunch and stories of her own day's adventures. But as they mounted their horses, Miguel made one final observation that stopped Wyatt cold. "Papa, do you think Grandfather would be proud of what we've built?" The question hung in the desert air like a prayer. Wyatt looked around at the abandoned ruins of Black Barrow, and then at his son's earnest face, and felt something shift inside his chest, not the old pain of loss and regret, but something new and clean and full of possibility. "I think," he said slowly, "that your grandfather would be amazed by what grew from the seeds he planted. He died believing that truth mattered more than comfort, that justice was worth any sacrifice, that ordinary people could do extraordinary things if they found the courage to act." He gestured toward the desert horizon, where dust devils danced in the afternoon heat and the mountains rose like ancient guardians against an endless sky. "Look around you, son. This place was built on lies, sustained by violence, and ruled by men who thought power was the only truth that mattered. Today it's empty, forgotten, reclaimed by the desert. But in Tucson, in our home, we've built something that will outlast any amount of stone and steel, a family founded on love, a community dedicated to justice, a legacy that honors the sacrifice of everyone who died to make it possible." Miguel nodded solemnly, understanding in his bones that he was part of something larger than himself, heir to a tradition of courage that stretched back through generations of people who'd chosen to stand up when it would have been easier to stay down. As they rode away from Black Barrow for the last time, Wyatt thought about the letter he'd received the previous week from Lena Walsh, now a respected businesswoman in her 60s, who still provided sanctuary for women in need. She'd written to tell him about a young prostitute who'd escaped from a brutal situation in Phoenix, seeking the kind of help that only someone who'd survived similar trauma could provide. "Send her to us," he'd written back immediately. "There's always room for one more. Because that's what you did when you'd been given a second chance at life. You made sure others got their second chances too. You built something good from the wreckage of what had been destroyed. You honored the dead by refusing to let their sacrifices be meaningless." That evening, as the Cross family gathered around their dinner table, Wyatt and Mira, Miguel and his 3 younger siblings, plus 2 recent arrivals, who were still learning to trust that kindness could exist without strings attached. Mira raised her hands to share the blessing she offered before every meal. "We are grateful." She signed her movements, graceful and sure. "For the food, we share the roof that shelters us and the love that binds us together. We remember those who came before us, especially those who gave their lives so that we might live freely. We commit ourselves to honoring their memory by extending the same courage and compassion to others that was shown to us in our darkest hours. Amen." Wyatt said aloud, and the children echoed him, their voices mixing with the whisper of desert wind through the open windows. Later, after the younger children had been put to bed, and Miguel had retreated to his room to study Wyatt, and Mira sat together on their porch as they had every night for more than a decade. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack with wild, lonely music. Mira reached for her slate and wrote, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't come to the cinder house that night?" It was a question she'd never asked before, though Wyatt suspected she'd thought about it often. The answer was complex, involving paths not taken, and choices that had seemed insignificant at the time, but had changed everything. "I think," he said carefully, "that eventually someone else would have helped you. You're too strong, too smart, too determined to have stayed trapped forever. Maybe it would have taken longer, maybe the cost would have been higher, but you would have found a way to escape." She considered this, then wrote, "But would we have found each other? I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe not in this life. But I like to think that souls recognize each other across time and space, that love finds a way to connect people who are meant to be together. It was a romantic notion, perhaps too romantic for a man who'd seen as much violence and cruelty as Wyatt Cross. But sitting there in the peaceful darkness with his wife beside him and their children safe in their beds, he allowed himself to believe in the possibility of destiny, of purpose, of second chances that led to something better than what had been lost. Mira wrote one final message before they went inside. "I used to dream of having my voice back. Now I dream of using the voice I have to help others find theirs. Thank you for teaching me that silence can be broken in many ways." As they prepared for bed, Wyatt reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. He'd started as a mining foreman, trying to forget his failures, become a reluctant hero fighting for justice, and ended up as something he'd never expected to be: a father, a husband, a pillar of his community. A man whose quiet daily choices made the world a little bit better. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was the life that had been given to him through a series of events that began with 3 dead miners and a girl who couldn't scream. From that darkness had come light, from that silence had come song, from that ending had come a beginning that was still unfolding after all these years. The desert wind whispered through the eaves of their house, carrying stories of the past and promises of the future. And in the bedroom where Wyatt and Mira Cross slept peacefully in each other's arms, the silence was no longer empty, but full of love, full of hope, full of the unspoken understanding that some victories are measured not in battles won, but in lives lived with purpose and grace. The silence had been broken, and what had emerged from that breaking was more beautiful than anything that had been lost. In the end, that was the greatest victory of all.